Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about a Linux distribution that has gained popularity somewhat. Zorin OS. Now, many times I've heard about stuff with Linux, especially considering Windows 8's been pretty controversial and considering Microsoft is dumping Windows XP in literally only 2 months. Linux and the people who make it have started to praise Linux and talk about how well it is to replace Windows XP and the like. Now, of course, Zorin OS tries to be a little different from Ubuntu by specifically targeting it to people who have never used any Linux and who just want a Linux to replace their Windows install. However, the only way to properly verify the claims is to actually put it to the test. So today I'm going to show you how Zorin OS runs on real hardware and how it runs on a real run-of-the-mill laptop. The laptop we're throwing it on is an old Acer laptop, straight from about 2010. However, it is so run-of-the-mill. Not only is it worn out with a touchpad that has a bunch of wear and USB ports bashed in and a dead LCD backlight, but it's also pretty weak. Perfect for a run-of-the-mill laptop to test it on. It only has a single core ultra-low voltage Athlon 64 with about as much power as an old Intel Pentium 4. And did I mention the USB ports are bashed in, so I have to install it from a CD? Of course, luckily for us, the CD drive still works, and so does the hard drive, and the power cable. And as you can see, the USB ports are literally bashed in, and of course, this is the perfect laptop to test Linux on, since after all, not everyone has i7s, especially not with who this is targeting. The first problem related to LCD screens. Unlike Windows, where it mirrors the screen by default and you push a button if you want it to extend or display on only one, Linux spreads the screen by default, or at least this Linux does. I had to go into the settings and pretty much disable it on Linux by having to shine the LCD into the light. Installing it was pretty annoying as well. Unlike my normal PC, when I installed Windows, it wouldn't let me install it right because it wouldn't automatically make the drive. I had to manually partition it to keep the Windows reinstall partition. And then what happened was, it threw up an error message saying I didn't set the root file system. It took me some Googling to realize that Linux doesn't by default, tell you which partition it wants to install on like Windows does. For example, the Windows Vista 7, 8, whatever installer. And this was pretty annoying because it took me a while to Google and find out that was the problem. Once that was done though, installation went mostly perfect. When I installed it, one of the first things I noticed was it was slow. And what do I mean by slow? Well, despite the fact that it had a weak processor, which is barely faster than a Pentium 4, and despite the fact that they claimed it runs faster than Windows 7 does, it actually ran far slower on the same hardware. Just look at how slow Software Center is. And all I wanted to do was download Steam, because Steam has a Linux version, and of course, with Linux, people talk about how Linux gaming is booming and stuff. However, the only way to actually verify that was to put it to the test. It came with a Software Center which was slow and only had a few basic Linux programs and did not have many big programs you're used to using on Windows, unless of course you use OpenOffice every day and not, say, that copy of Microsoft Office your job uses, or Visual Studio. If you don't use Visual Studio, you're fine, but if you have a class that requires Visual Studio, this Linux is useless, as you'll see later. But anyways, let's get back on topic. The game stuff. there are very few games, and the majority of them are clones of, well, other games for Linux. I mean Windows, basic games. That's a lot of what's on here. But of course, Steam and Valve are trying to bring Linux gaming full circle mainstream. So I'm going to install that, and I'm going to see how it works. Because after all, that's the only way to actually verify stuff, is to put it to the test. And did I mention that the Software Center wanted me to sign to a Ubuntu One account? Why Ubuntu? Because all Zorin OS is just a fork of Ubuntu. But I really don't get why I have to sign in an account on Linux to download a free program when not only can I go to Steam and download it without having to make a separate account, but also when Linux and the like never used to make me make an account. That's just, I don't know, man. Despite owning a ton of games on Steam, if I go on Linux, many of them won't work. And with Steam for Linux or Mac OS, when you see a game that won't work on your platform, you won't see an install button whatsoever. And as you can see, many of the games I own, there are no install buttons. And when I click Linux games, it drops from nearly 100 to only about a quarter of the games I own. And the majority of them are from Valve, with a handful of indie games I was given by friends, and Dust and Elysian Tale, which I'm surprised considering how it used XNA and everything, but it surprisingly worked the best out of all the Linux games I tried on this laptop, which is surprising considering Linux has bad drivers. And again, Dust is a 2D game, so that might explain it. To test native Linux gaming on this computer, I installed a random game which I know will work on nearly every computer in existence, the original Half-Life. It runs on everything from netbooks to old Pentium 4s, I mean early Pentium 4s, with like ATI Rage, Cairo 2, TNT 2, you know, those kind of video cards. And considering that this is a video card that can run, let's just say, it's a Radeon 3200 built in, the frame rate is terrible. I mean, I didn't expect much because this is only about as powerful as a Pentium 4, but good lord, the frame rate is terrible. It's about as much as that of an old Pentium 3. I also tried Wine, which came with the OS. And no matter what I did, many programs I threw at it just flat out didn't work. And I tried many big ones too. I tried several versions of Office, Windows Movie Maker, Visual Studio 2010, because those are programs I've used for my college work, because initially when I was filming this, I attempted to see what programs I used for my college would actually run on this, and unsurprisingly, tons of stuff didn't work, especially Windows programs. While Linux comes, and this Linux in particular, comes with many clones of popular Windows programs, or the open source programs you can also find for Windows for free, it just has issues with tons of programs. Several versions of Office failed to install along with Visual Studio, and I just can't use this. Especially considering on the website, this program, Zorin OS, is advertised to run your Windows stuff. It couldn't run my Windows stuff, or it couldn't run it very well. And speaking of Wine, I also tried to play a game I had which was on disk, Halo Combat Evolved. Despite having an installer issue, it turned out the issue was due to not having a library installed. After installing the library, the game's installer worked just fine. However, I had bizarre glitches, such as this one, where I had to go in and change the resolution, and sometimes the game would just scale itself to a random window. It did this to me a lot. Did I mention the frame rate was terrible the second I even got into the game? Especially considering that Linux and stuff has issues running games. And that's pretty much a common fact. You can turn it all the way down to the lowest settings, or high, or I mean, even I imagine turned down to the lowest settings, and it just didn't work. I'm not making this up. I mean, let me just show you. I'm going to join a random game. Check out this frame rate. Wow. Considering I was able to run Halo 1 on old Intel chipset GPUs from the Pentium 4 era, the early Pentium 4 era, yeah, I think this is just bad. While due to the USB ports being bashed in, I wasn't able to test many USB devices, but I was able to test, well, I was able to get printers working, and that's pretty easy because my laser jets have drivers for everything in the universe. However, I did have other issues with stuff. For example, I tried to show you, I can push the Windows key and it won't do anything. Windows D, Windows M, Windows, any of that won't do anything. And you can't see this on the screen, but the only thing that works is Windows Tab and Alt Tab. Windows M, Windows D, Windows U, Windows L, all those key combinations, I tried random ones, they don't work in Zorin OS, which is a bad thing considering how this is advertised to people who have never ever used a Linux before. But hey, it does have multiple desktops, something we get on Windows with a free add-on. All in all, I would not recommend Zorin OS. Sure, it might have a Tetris clone, but does it have all the games you'd want? Does it have all your software? I mean, there really isn't a reason to download this, considering that it just doesn't do what it's supposed to. I mean, you want software? Sure, you can get a copy of Windows with a new laptop. Linux, it doesn't run anything. It can run clones of Tetris, but can it run your Microsoft Office? And by Office, I don't mean OpenOffice, I mean the real thing. It can't do that. Can it play new games? It can't do that. Can it open Visual Studio? It can't do that. Can it go into Flash and stuff? It can do it, I think. But it didn't even run that well when I tried it. I tried watching a video at full screen. Not even HD. And it stuttered like crazy. All in all, I would not recommend this Linux distribution. It's got serious issues with usability, especially if you're just trying to run this on your run-of-the-mill XP computer. Considering how many issues it had on a Windows 7 era computer, I would not recommend this. Please don't use this Linux. I mean, if you really need a replacement for XP, you can get Vista 7, 8.1 on the internet. I mean, they don't cost too much, and I'd recommend getting those instead of Zorin OS. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more. And the thing is, many of these issues I mentioned don't just apply to Zorin OS. They apply to Linux in general. Especially considering how bloated Ubuntu is now. And the final thing I have to say on this, from my experience, well, let's just say, take a look at all the programs you use today. And I don't mean your web browser, I mean like, let's just say Office, Visual Studio, Adobe, whatever program your piece of hardware that's not available on Linux requires. Like, let's just say your scanner, for example. Take a look and see if they have Linux versions. Because last time I checked, Adobe, Office, and other big name programs don't run on Linux still. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.